Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to another session from our kickoff day for Connected Educators. This has really been a terrific day and a lot of fun, and I can't imagine a better moment right now than to hear from Deborah Meier. She's our keynote speaker. If you are just discovering Connected Educator Month, please do sign up at the website, connectededucatormonth.org, and you'll get updates on everything that's going on. Today's been a fun-filled day. After Deborah speaks, in 2 hours at 7 p.m., Chris Lehman is also going to speak, and then tomorrow there's lots of fun that starts off with Douglas Rushkoff and other panels. So please stay tuned. If you can pull yourself away from the Olympics long enough, there's lots of good material. So Deborah has been was a public educator for over 45 years. Her most recent book was Playing for Keeps, Life and Learning on a Public School Playground. And I must say, we're really excited to have you here. I'm going to turn the time over to you, and then when you're ready, tell me, and we'll shift to Q&A.
Hello there. I'm slightly intimidated by this format, but never too intimidating. So it's good to be with you, and I hope you all stay on for Chris Lehman, who is a good friend, and for years ran a marvelous school upstate New York. And he's one of the people who influenced me to go from being a kindergarten teacher to trying out being a high school principal and teacher in the middle of my career. I started out, in fact, as a substitute teacher. Some of you know that nothing could be more horrible, difficult, and especially for someone who went into it thinking it would be a cinch, a nice way to spend it 2 days a week and make a little extra money. But I got interested in schools in the process, and my own children were just about to start school, and they were much more, they worried me more than I had even expected for our country as well as my own children. But then I had an opportunity to teach half-time kindergarten and fell in love with being a teacher, not just thinking about the relationship between our schools and our democracy, which was the sort of the original impulse and impetus for my fascination. I was trying to figure out what about the schooling, the public schooling in cities like Chicago, where I started, and the enterprise of democracy. What is it that spending 12 years in schools did to help you be a good citizen, or to have no effect on citizenship, or to actually discourage good citizenship? And I thought of kindergarten as kind of a distraction from that interest, and just fell in love because they were so interesting. Kids were so fascinating. I just was filled with stories that maybe bored my friends, but there were always some friends who laughed at the right places and who encouraged me. And I even then went to Philadelphia for a year and taught 4-year-olds, 3- and 4-year-olds. And had the first year of Head Start, and moved to New York City and taught kindergarten. And at some point, got an incredible offer from a superintendent in East Harlem to start my own school. And in 1974, I got a few friends of mine together, and we began a kindergarten through 6th grade school in East Harlem. And it was a enormously more difficult experience than I expected. There were issues that even among my best friends, I didn't expect disagreements. But here we were, free to do what we wanted. And we decided that the one thing we definitely wanted was to be a democratic community, where every one of the voices of the adults' voices, particularly the adults who worked in the school and who could meet together often, could be heard and acted upon. That we didn't have to ask permission very often. We had to think about what parents would tolerate and what worked with kids. But we kind of brushed off all other considerations, and we had a superintendent, Tony Alvarado, who led us. And over the next 10 plus years, we did lots of things wrong, but we did incredibly many things right. And the most right thing was relationships. The relationships between the adults, the capacity of adults to find the time to learn on the job and to go away together to contemplate what they had done, to visit each other's classrooms, to have time to sit down with parents and find out what they knew about their children, and to have them share with us aspects of the culture that we were entering that we might otherwise have been ignorant about. And we had a number of little crises between parents and staff and between members of the staff, and the struggling through those was, we think, not only good for us, but helped us understand better what it means to have a democratic community, the kinds of compromises you can and can't make. The kind of respect you have to have for each other, how hard it is to really listen to children, their families, and your colleagues. And to listen in a way that left open the possibility that you were wrong and they were right. So even when 5-year-old Daryl announced to me that rocks were living things, we were supposed to be teaching about living and non-living things, and he was absolutely tenacious. And he presented an argument in behalf of his theory that persuaded most of the kids, and made it hard for me to think what evidence I could bring to bear on my side of the argument. And I decided that we would leave it and come back another day. And we came back many other days, struggling with the question of what do we mean by living and non-living, and all the different ways of thinking about it, including Daryl's way of thinking about it. And consulting with local scientists, one of my close scientist friends told me, in fact, that he thought Daryl was on the edge, the cutting edge of modern science, that living versus non-living is much more complex than we used to think it was. It left, given that kind of open-mindedness, it left one always breathless with excitement. And the classroom itself then became a very different place when the adults in it were genuinely learning alongside of the kids. They brought to bear certain understandings that the kids didn't have, but it was of no use to the kids unless they could join each other. And joining with the interests of learners isn't easy, but once you begin to get the knack of it, it keeps you intellectually alive yourself. And I think is at the heart of what makes democracy possible. Not inevitable, but possible. If we don't consider the possibility that we might be wrong, even on some rather fundamental questions, I think we are much less accessible to our neighbors and our fellow citizens. And if we're less accessible, our voice won't be heard as well, and we won't have the patience to put up with democracy. When we're in a hurry and when we think we have to make a decision that it's very important, the natural tendency seems to be to retreat to an authoritarian stance. Democracy is often seen as a luxury. And if we want to see it as an essential, an enormously important tool for bringing forth the very best qualities in human beings and in human civilizations, then we have to be patient with democracy. Some people say to me, well, we lost when we tried that last time, so there's no point. I'm not going to try again. And if people change their mind as easily as we would like them to, then it means that we would change our minds as easily as they would like us to. And those changing your mind all the time is a symptom of not taking anything very seriously. Being open is not the same thing as and acknowledging the importance of other people's ideas should not be confused to giving in to everybody's ideas. That's your opinion. This is my opinion. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm right. That should just be the openness to begin to discover and take apart your own understanding and other people's. And that's what we finally codified when we started the secondary school in East Harlem called Central Park East Secondary School. We codified it to 5 essential habits of mind, which we said was what the Common Core curriculum of our school was. Whether we were teachers of science or teachers of literature or teachers of math or teachers of history, there would be 5 questions which would be at the heart of our selection of curriculum as well as our pedagogy, how we taught things. And those 5 were, if I can remember them, the first one was, what's the evidence? How do you know that? How credible is it? And the second one was, does it connect with other things you know? Is there a pattern here somewhere? And the third was, what if something had been different? What if Washington had died during the war, the Revolutionary War? What if we had lost the Civil War? What if it had rained on last Tuesday? And what if x plus 4, the x is a 6 versus a 4, what does it do? And so on, from science to literature to history, that what if question. And I'm leaving one out, but it doesn't matter. The last one was, who cares anyway? What difference does it make? And these 5 habits, 4 of which I have just tried to describe, were part of our conversation within school, part of our conversation in classrooms and staff meetings, and we tried wherever possible to show how they were useful on the playground, in the assessment of a basketball game, in looking at presidential elections, and looking at statements that people make in presidential elections, and looking at our own lives and the lives of others. And it became kind of habits. What are habits? Habits are those things, whether they're good or bad, that are hard to get rid of. When I pass a person in the street, when I pass someone in the street who's begging, I have a habit of wondering, what if I were them? Could I be them? And how could I? And I try, especially where there are a lot of people begging in the street, to prepare myself so that I have maybe a few coins that I can give and assuage my conscience, but not to walk past as though they aren't there. And that's a habit I can't get out of, and many times would like to. I imagine one of them is my son. What would happen if this and if that? And I want the young people who go to our school to graduate with hard-to-break habits that make them good neighbors and good citizens. And I fear that very few schools in America might today even be able to explore that, given the increasing use of standardized tests to measure ourselves and the use of standardized curriculum. I think it's harder and harder to hear what kids and colleagues are saying. And it's harder and harder to think maybe answer B is the right answer, not C. The test maker says it's D, but maybe he's wrong. Maybe if he saw it this way or that way. We're invested in creating schools that spend 12 years focused on finding what someone else thinks are the right answer out of 4 or 5. That's the opposite of what we need to build a culture that can maintain, sustain, and nourish democracy. That's essence of my argument. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was fascinating. There are a number of questions in the chat about where can people find those 5 essential habits of mind. And, it looks like someone found it. Brenda Sherry put a link in the chat. Okay, so Deborah said that.
Thank you, Brenda.
That she's willing to take Q&A. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask, this is a time when you can either put them in the chat or you can raise your hand. To raise your hand, you click on the 3rd icon over in the participant window, and that lets us know you want to take the microphone. So I know that you had talked about, in a phone conversation you and I had, about how to survive in your native land, and I think you blogged on this as well. How does that tie in with what you've just discussed?
Well, it's what makes me kind of sad these days. First of all, I'm sad because I'm not in the middle of a classroom, and being in the middle of school always kept me feeling hopeful about the world, because at least while I'm there, there's something I can do to create a wider and opener world. But there's so much going on in our country today, in our native land, that I love so dearly, and in our native planet, that makes democracy seem irrelevant and makes us look upon the goal and purpose of education in life as making a profit, being efficient. And that is my phone ringing. And they lead us not to curiosity, but to calculation. And calculation has a role in life. I'm right now engaged in arguments with some friends about the value of algebra. But to see schools turned into competing business entities measured by standardized tests of a standardized curriculum suggests that we have sold out public education at a very cheap price. And then I fear for it having any future, much less a future devoted to promoting democracy. Schools are the way we raise our young, and they have a public as well as a private purpose. And the public purpose is to cherish some ideals that we share in common, and some ideals that we don't share in common, that we want others to be able to have a chance to hear. And if the only ideal that counts is getting the right answer on standardized tests that will lead you to keep your job, make more money, be allowed to go to a better college so that you can get a better job, if that's the only ethos in which we are operating, democracy doesn't stand much chance. It's too complicated, too problematic an institution. It's too fragile and, to survive unless it's very high on our list of priorities. So, how do you survive? Well, you keep in mind that it's always more exciting to do things that you believe in than to do things that you think are wrong. So you look for every opportunity that exists. My old mentor, Lillian Weber, used to say you look for all the cracks in the sidewalk, all the cracks in the wall. And then you try to think, what can I push in there that would widen the cracks so that we can put more good things on the table. I'm mixing so many metaphors. But it means you frequently don't ask permission. It's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, as I recall. You are a rebel where necessary. You do as little harm as you possibly can get away with, and none if you can. You'll do harm sometimes out of the best of intentions, but to do harm purposely because it will please your supervisors or the legislators, well, sometimes you may even have to do that. That's one of the things we used to talk about at school. It's part of the relationship between grown-ups and young people to talk about trade-offs. I would discuss with the kids in the morning if I had gotten a traffic ticket on the way to school. I would bring it up. How I handled it, was I right, was I wrong? Because these are questions that are fundamental, and we can't live saintly lives, perhaps, but we can aim for it. And schools need to be fun and interesting. So you pay a higher price for creating a fun and interesting and stimulating classroom. You get less praise for it. People come in and mark you down for it. And in some cases, you lose your job for it. I think we each have, every day of our teaching life, have to think about that and think about it with our colleagues and think about what things we might do that are a little risky and a little more courageous to change the climate of our classroom, our school, and our nation on what the purpose of public education is.
Reminded me of a saying my dad has often used: when it's hard to measure what's valuable, we end up valuing what's easy to measure. I'm wondering if you're going to Save Our Schools tomorrow, I think, and are you seeing a shift in the ability for educators through social media to talk to each other in positive ways? Certainly your blog would seem to be an example of that.
I hope so. I think there is a growing worry about what's happening in American public education. The trouble is that while I see a growing sentiment building and coalescing around a critique of the current climate, the bipartisan consensus around corporate style education, that's growing, but if it's growing fast enough to stop the other side, I don't know, because the amount of money being spent, the amount of power being used to turn public education into a profit-making institution. You know, someone asked, was it Willie, somebody or other, why he robbed banks, and he said that's where the money is. There's a lot of money in public enterprises, and schools are one of those places. We've begun to do the same with public prisons. More and more of them are private. We're perhaps about to make our postal system private. And the people who have power, I think, are consciously aware that they have to move very fast, so it'll be hard for us to undo it, even if we finally get to a majority of the people. And they might be right. Some things are hard to recreate. And public schools have been with us for 150 years. And if we let it go, it may be hard to recreate it. I'm not sure, but I worry about that. And so, yes, there are, I forget how many, but several thousands of people, and more importantly, in some ways, organizations and school boards who've signed on to a resolution against high-stakes testing. And probably that's one of the first things of importance. And I don't mean just not too much of it. Of course, the more, the worse. But high-stakes testing is nonsense. Because the higher the stakes, the less reliable is the data. There's no question about it that we will, almost all of us, if you make the stakes high enough, find a way to cheat the purpose of the test. You may cheat directly or indirectly, but we have made those stakes so high that it's hard for me to morally condemn those who find ways to get around it. But the tests have become our definition of what it means to be an educated person. we all know better, but it's one of the hopes that we have obstacles courses. And kids who refuse, or teachers who refuse to see that as the purpose of their profession, pay a heavy price. And I don't know how to give advice to them, but the high-stakes testing, the opposition to high-stakes testing, I think, is growing, even as the number of high-stakes tests that we're being measured by is increasing, and even as the number of purposes for which it's being used is daily increasing. And but I think there's growing skepticism among well-meaning people who have taken middle-of-the-road positions in the past. I can't remember. I've read several columnists recently who, in the past, were not fans of STEM-based testing, but thought it was important to do, who are beginning to question it. Now, the other threat is this common curriculum, and the third threat is the privatization of schools themselves, the schools being governed by people who have whose only stake in the school is financial. Rather than by the parents and students in the school. In the 1960s, I was one of those people who thought both sides were wrong in the centralization-decentralization debates, because I thought, in New York City at least, when we talked about decentralization, we were talking about decentralizing schools so that the people in the district could have some voice in the decisions about the schools in their district, but districts were the size of the average American city in New York City. There were 30 districts. Districts rang from 25 to 45,000 students. It was, I think, basically a good idea, but that it didn't go far enough, because I think we have to weight the vote or the power or the influence of the people who are directly responsible in raising children, parents, teachers, and even students. Mission Hill, the school that we started in Boston, is a regular public school, so to speak. It's part of the union contract and supported by the union and management, but it has its own board. And part of the power of that board is fictional. It could be taken away from us. But that board is made up of a third of people selected by the parents, a third of people selected by the staff members. Actually, we did it on a rotating basis. And I don't mean half, a third parents, a third faculty and staff, and the third people that those two groups together selected who were outside of the school, external respected external authorities of one sort or another, head of a museum, a former graduate, somebody who could give us a more distanced perspective on the school. And at some point we added students. The school went to 8th grade, and we added 7th and 8th grade students. And we developed a system for creating a semi-consensus so that every one of those groups could veto the critical decisions, that is, the principal, the handling of the budget and so forth. But so that there was a stake in our figuring out things together. And it worked efficiently and effectively for the many years, and it still works. So that was, some people said it was like a charter school. No, there's no reason why all of our public schools can't borrow the best of the charter schools and abandon the worst aspects of it.
So I don't know how much time you had budgeted. Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Are there more questions?
There was a good question that
are there questions?
There are questions.
Oh, I can't tell when you're asking a question.
No, there is a question. So Ellie Fadden wanted to make this comment. She says, I do have to say that having worked in corporate America for a long time, there are some efficiencies that we can model. How do you respond to that?
In a school that cares a lot about what it does, we're always interested in ideas. So, for example, and some of those ideas might come from corporations. They come from any kind of organization. And I think we should be open both ways. I think we have a lot to help corporations. I mean, the corporations haven't done so well for us in the last 10, 15 years. But so we have some things we might help them think about, and they have some ideas we ought to think about. It's the relationship of power that concerns me. So I'm not against corporations. I'm against their using their expertise in their own field to and the power that it has brought them to have a sort of presumption about its effectiveness in other fields. Now, they might be. I have ideas about how corporations could be run more democratically and how they could pay more attention. There was a period in which we were very fascinated by some of the work going on in Japanese corporations and ways in which they worked differently than American corporations. And I found some of those ideas very useful for me. Toyota, there's a book by, I forget his name, I think his name is Brown, I can't remember the first name, about Toyota. And he describes ways in which Toyota decentralized its decision-making and assessment systems in order to catch mistakes and to be more efficient. So I think there are times in which hearing from the bottom and taking seriously the ideas of the people who are on the floor, if you will, on the ground, leads to more efficiency. So there was 2 exceptions to democratic decision-making at Mission Hill, and one was decisions that I, the technical principal of the school, thought were fiscally irresponsible and dangerous. And the other was decisions that I thought endangered the safety and health of any other human beings, children, faculty members, parents. My veto was not, it's a little like the president's veto. It wasn't the final word, but it meant that at least at the moment we couldn't go ahead on that road until we had worked out either among ourselves or with a mediator, or with the changing of leadership. But blocked in our decision making. And we don't have a good method except every 4 years for doing that in the United States. And that may be a problem, which some other democracies solve other ways. But yes, I think we have a lot to learn about the most effective way to manage our operations. So I'd love to hear yours.
Am I right in remembering that you were a Deming fan?
Yes, that's his name. Thank
so,
you.
I mean, one of his basic principles was driving out fear. And we hear a lot about trust, especially in the telling of the story of Finland. How important is trust to you in that relationship between administrators and teachers?
Well, it's enormously important, and I wrote a book called In Schools We Trust, trying to describe the kind of trust, because trust is a very open-ended word. I could trust someone to teach me to fly an airplane who I wouldn't trust to babysit for my children. So it's not a question of trust or, trust versus no trust. And in fact, we had a wonderful evening session once at Pennsylvania Secondary School on this question of trying with parents and their students and their children to discuss what it means when a parent said, "I don't trust you to take the car out tonight." And the kids would say, "Oh, you don't trust me." And say, "Yes, I trust you in some areas and not in others." But so it's a fascinating subject trust. But I want to go back a step to your question about fear. I think the underlying issue, and it connects with trust, is that you're not a very effective learner when you're in a state of fear. Then you're thinking only about how to avoid the lion, the tiger, the F grade, the bully. And you can sometimes have to function out of fear. But that the most important work we do in school, fear is an enemy. There's a wonderful book written 50 years ago by a man named John Holt. The first book he wrote, he became a libertarian, was a book about children's learning. And if there's anybody listening who remembers the name of that book, How Children Fail, or something like that. How Children Fail, I think, and his description of how we cover our tracks when we're afraid, and how inefficient it is to do so, but necessary at times. So you have to balance that. It's true especially in schools because there's 3 levels of trust there, or 4 levels. There's students trusting that you have an agenda that's on their side. And that's the cause for a lot of problems that have racial overtones. What would lead children who come from all African American communities to necessarily trust that this white teacher either has enough knowledge to be trusted or has good enough intentions to be trusted? And what makes their parents think so? And there's nobody can get away from that. That's why it's so tragic that we have not solved in any way whatsoever the integration decision of 1954, imagine. We were supposed to desegregate our schools, and they're more segregated than ever. But part of the reason is to begin to learn to trust precisely people whom it's harder to trust. And it takes a little bit more time. You can't just walk into the classroom and say, trust me. You have to become a trustworthy person to be trusted. And it takes time. And that's why I like small schools, and that's why I like to devote a lot of time for families to get to know people in school well, so that they can work through their issues of trust, because it's hard to trust someone your parents don't trust. It's hard not to be afraid when you walk into school and withdraw your intellectual capacities, not think honestly and seriously about what's on the table, because you're afraid you're going to make a mistake, because you're afraid that person is trying to catch you in a mistake. You're afraid the kid next to you will laugh at you. All of these kinds of questions where fear and trust become counterproductive to each other. So, yeah, we need, and that's, as I said, what's eerie is I was leading a whole coalition, the Coalition of the Central Schools, on an agenda of creating more smaller schools in which people knew each other better, and where possible, schools of choice, led by Ted Sizer of Brown University and Harvard University. And in some ways, the charter movement at first appeared to be kind of picking up that message. And I was rather excited. But unfortunately, their message turned out to be something rather different.
You've got a couple of questions from Scott in the chat. The first is, he wants to know your thoughts on what's called open source education. Are you familiar with that term?
Is it different than online?
I think it would be. I don't want to speak for Scott, but I'm thinking that it relates to open content, openly available content that's licensed for free. Scott, maybe you can correct me in the chat if I'm not getting that exactly right. Yeah, he's saying open and free content.
It's impossible for me to be against opening as much knowledge as possible and as freely as possible. So yes, I'm for opening it. And a good classroom turns down no source, even wrong sources, because learning how to judge a source doesn't work in a classroom if the teacher only presents sources that she thinks are foolproof. So you have to expose kids to many different kinds of sources of information and let them fool around with it and play with it and explore it with those 5 habits of mind in their minds as they do so. But maybe Scott has some other...
No, I think it was exactly right. He also asks about other metrics and learning analytics, and I'm wondering if there's another lesson from Deming. So in a world in which there's an increasing ability to measure and store data, is part of the difficulty that oftentimes that data is thought of as being part of an authoritarian structure rather than kind of a dashboard for the learner, him or herself?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, data can be a way of manipulating you. And so data is, if the data is correct, it says one thing, but you can even have correct data that is placed in the wrong context. It's correct for a certain context. And that's partly what all those habits of mind were about, was to try to be able to take almost any object and play around with it to see all the potential ways of assessing it and seeing its value. You know, I was just talking to someone about the Consumers Union, which magazine I get. And what's fascinating is to think about how they assess products that are completely standardized. And they treat that standardized product with more respect than the school systems treats the totally unstandardized product of human beings. So, for example, if they're judging a car, they're looking at its inside dimensions, how much storage it has, how fast it will go, how much gasoline it will use, whether the dashboard is simple, whether it's to use, whether it gives a smooth ride. Quite a list, and probably leaves off a few things. And what they're expecting you to do is not for them to choose the car for you, but for you to use that data in a way that is related to your goals and your agenda. So we're treating people, not products. We're treating unstandardized human beings, and we think we can sum them up in 2 or 3 measures. And somehow, in this incredibly important question of how we spend our life from the age of 3 to 4 to 18 to 21, we have this bizarre, absurd, ridiculous assessment system in which we count the views of the people who know that individual as least important precisely because they, too, are unique and unstandardized. So it's like we're living in another world and pretending. We're pretending that there is such a thing as a standardized, unbiased system for making judgments that are of great importance about complex human beings. I find it so absurd that sometimes I have a difficult time arguing logically about it because I can't think about how anyone could have ever imagined that this was a sensible thing to do. Sometimes I've given kids all the same question to answer by themselves, and then we've explored afterwards the differences. Yes, they're sometimes worth giving a standardized question precisely so you can explore the different ways human beings have of answering. And I did that with standardized tests many times. And I wrote a little book about it. If you go to my website, deborahmeier.com, you can find among my articles I wrote about these interviews. One of them was called Reading Failure and the Tests, or Tests and the Reading Failure. I can't remember the title exactly. It was written in the early 1970s, and it was a sort of a freedom account of my interview with children about why they answered A, B, C, or D. And it was breathtaking, because the smartest answers were often the wrong answers, and some of the dumbest answers in an interview were often the right ones. And I sometimes myself got unsure about which was the right answer. Now, generally, I knew because I knew how test makers think, and I knew what they were looking for was a kind of cliched response. But children, the younger they are, the less they are aware of all the cliches. If you ask a 3-year-old what's the opposite of night, they will not say day. We learned that. And because opposite is actually a very complicated idea. And so part of it we just learn by rote, and part of it we learn by putting together a whole series of experiences with the idea of opposites. Anyway, the potential we have for being smart is so much greater than we're allowed to exercise. And the younger we do that, the more dangerous.
So we probably have time for one more question, then we need to let Deborah go. If you have a question you'd like to put in the chat, or if I've missed a question, please post it again and I will try and attend to it. Or you can raise your hand by clicking on the raise the hand icon in the...
Yeah, and you can also ask me through email and website.
Terrific. And it's DeborahMeier.com, right?
Right. MEIER. Oh, it's up there on the screen.
So Jackie Gerstein asks, do you have recommendations for teacher education to make these changes? You would need very courageous teacher educators, who I think are collapsing even faster than teachers. Look at the field of early childhood. I just got a complaint. I mean the early childhood organizations, individual educators and the NAUIC should have just stood up a long time ago and said, this is absurd. This is not what we know young children is good for young children. And instead of which, we're always looking for how we can adapt. So I think a lot more. I used to say if you have tenure in you, but you can't even be brave once you have tenure anymore. We have to get enough of us to be brave, and that's why I'm encouraged by groups like the SOS. It would be wonderful if we've found a way to get 100,000 teachers someday together in one place to say no, we're not budging. And will they find the people who replace us? Well, that's a worry of mine. I have lately had unemployed 50-year-old children. We live in a time in which it's hard for people to say, I'm willing to risk even my job for my beliefs. But write anonymous letters if you must. We have got to stop this. We have got to. And the more we care about our work, the more determined we have to be not to allow people to think we're just going along. Now, of course, there are unions out there, and if we fall for the nonsense that unions are our enemy, that has been perpetuated. The Chamber of Commerce is a collection of businessmen, and they have their faults as an organization. They probably don't vote on everything, but somehow or other, we have been bullied into thinking that our unions are a self-interest group, rather than the way in which we speak collectively about conditions that, a businessman wants to make a profit. He says that, quite frankly. Teachers want to make a good salary. We say that frankly. But we want other things as well.
and I would like to think that the Chamber of Commerce wants other things besides to make money. But we sure do. But we don't have to be embarrassed by the fact that we also want a good salary and Social Security and medical plans. And we can't bargain for that individually. We have to work for that collectively. So that's a place where we need to pour some energy. And then the professional organizations who have to a considerable degree capitulated on a great many issues facing us today. There's nothing wrong with a Common Core curriculum in classes, except if it's mandated and it's assessed by a single tool, or especially a high-stakes one. I always found the New York City manual on suggestions for what we should teach in kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade very interesting. Some of them were put together by wonderful people. But I never let it interfere with what I could see in front of my eyes, which is that children were excited by something and we had to stick with it rather than move on next week to the next item in our curriculum. So we have to hold on to that unique power we have as the people closest to the children within the school system. And we have to find every organized and disorganized way we can to reassert our influence. There are a lot of us. And do read my blogs and read, go look at my suggestions for books to read. And a lot of the articles in my bibliography are available with a click. So thank you all for listening to me.
Deborah, thank you so much. I am clapping, which we do here by hovering over the smiley face and going down to the applause button. So appreciative of your being here with us tonight. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Deborah Meier, deborahmeier.com. In an hour, we get to hear from Chris Lehman. We'll go ahead and turn the recording off here and close the room. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody, and good night. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Steve. Can you tell Steve